I was sitting in my home office in Portland, Oregon, staring at the most absurd document I'd ever received when my wife called from downstairs asking what was wrong. The certified letter had arrived 3 days ago, and I'd read it at least 20 times since then, each reading making me angrier than the last. The Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association was placing a lien on my house for $8,000 in unpaid fines, late fees, and legal costs. The problem was simple and infuriating. I wasn't part of their HOA. I'd never been part of their HOA. My house wasn't even in their neighborhood. My name is Derek Emerson, and I'd lived at 4782 Clearwater Drive for 3 years. When my wife and I bought the place back in 2023, one of the main selling points was that there was no HOA. We'd specifically searched for non-HOA properties because we'd heard enough horror stories from friends and family about tyrannical board members measuring grass height and dictating paint colors. The house was perfect. A 1960s ranch-style home on half an acre with mature oak trees and enough distance from neighbors that we could actually enjoy some privacy. The property sat on the eastern edge of a quiet residential area, backing up to a small creek. Across the street, and about 200 yards north, was Meadowbrook Estates, a newer development built in 2015 with cookie-cutter houses, manicured lawns, and apparently an HOA with a serious problem. I called the number on the letterhead immediately. A woman answered on the third ring with a crisp, professional tone that somehow managed to sound condescending. Meadowbrook Estates HOA, this is Brenda speaking. Hi, my name is Derek Emerson. I received a letter about a lien on my property, but there's been a mistake. I'm not part of your HOA. There was a pause, the sound of typing. Address: 4782 Clearwater Drive. More typing. Mr. Emerson, according to our records, you've been assessed multiple violations over the past 18 months. You've failed to respond to any notices, failed to attend hearings, and failed to pay any fines. The lien is valid and has been filed with Multnomah County. That's impossible, I said, trying to keep my voice level. My house isn't in Meadowbrook Estates. I'm not part of your association. I never signed any HOA documents. Sir, if you'd like to dispute the fines, you needed to do so within 30 days of each violation notice. That time has passed. The lien stands unless you pay the full amount or arrange a payment plan. I never received any violation notices, I said, my frustration mounting. Because I'm not in your HOA. Who can I speak to about this? You can contact our HOA president, Deborah Winters. She'll be at our next board meeting on the 15th. You're welcome to attend and present your case. The 15th is 2 weeks away. I need this resolved now. I'm sorry, sir. That's the soonest available. She gave me an email address and hung up before I could argue further. I sat there for a long moment, my jaw clenched. Then I pulled out every document from our house purchase. The deed, the title insurance, the disclosure statements, the property survey. Nothing mentioned an HOA. There were no covenants, conditions, or restrictions attached to the property. It was clean, simple, and completely HOA-free. My wife, Sarah, came into the office with 2 cups of coffee. What's going on? I explained the situation while she listened, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. That's insane. How can they just put a lien on a house that's not even in their neighborhood? I don't know, but apparently they've already filed it with the county. This is going to be a nightmare to untangle. Sarah sat down across from me, reading through the letter. What are the violations even for? I pulled out the attached sheet. Let's see. Parking a commercial vehicle in the driveway, failure to maintain landscaping standards, unapproved fence installation, storing trash cans visible from the street, and painting the house an unapproved color, none of which I've done. You park your work truck in the driveway, Sarah pointed out, which is my right on my own property that isn't governed by an HOA. I ran my hand through my hair. This is ridiculous. I spent the next 2 days trying to handle it myself. I sent a detailed email to Deborah Winters explaining the situation and attaching copies of my property documents. I called the Multnomah County Recorder's office and confirmed that, yes, a lien had been filed against my property. The clerk was sympathetic, but explained that the HOA had followed the proper legal procedures for filing a lien. The fact that the lien might be invalid was something I'd need to resolve with the HOA or through the courts. I called the HOA office 4 more times. Twice I got voicemail. Once I got Brenda again, who told me she'd forwarded my information to the board and I'd need to wait for their response. The 4th time, a different woman answered and seemed genuinely confused by the situation, promising to look into it and call me back. She never did. By Friday, I'd heard nothing from Deborah Winters. No email, no phone call, nothing. The stress was starting to affect my sleep. I worked as a construction supervisor and I couldn't afford to have a lien on my property. It would affect my credit, potentially impact my job, and make it impossible to refinance or sell if we ever needed to. Sarah suggested we get a lawyer, and I finally admitted she was right. I asked around at work, and one of the guys recommended Robert Martinez, a real estate attorney who'd helped his sister with a property dispute. I called Martinez's office that afternoon, and his paralegal scheduled an appointment for Monday morning. The weekend dragged by. I found myself driving past Meadowbrook Estates, looking at the identical houses with their perfect lawns and matching mailboxes. The entrance had a fancy stone sign with the neighborhood name in bronze letters. There were streetlights every 50 feet, sidewalks on both sides, and not a single house that looked more than 10 years old. My house, by contrast, had character. It had history. It had a yard where we could actually do things without worrying about some busybody measuring our grass with a ruler. Monday morning, I drove to Robert Martinez's office in downtown Portland. The building was an older brick structure near the courthouse, the kind of place that looked like it had been there forever. Martinez himself was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with dark hair starting to gray at the temples and a firm handshake. "Tell me what's going on," he said after we'd settled into his office. I laid out the whole story, showing him the lien notice, my property documents, and the email chain with the HOA. He listened without interrupting, making notes on a legal pad. "This is more common than you'd think," he said when I finished. HOAs sometimes expand their enforcement beyond their actual jurisdiction, either through ignorance or overreach. The question is whether this is a genuine mistake or something more deliberate. What do you mean, deliberate? Sometimes HOAs try to claim properties that border their neighborhoods, hoping to expand their authority and their revenue stream. Your property is right next to Meadowbrook Estates, correct? Across the street and north, yeah. They might be hoping you'll just pay to make it go away. He flipped through my documents. But you've got a strong case. Your deed makes no mention of HOA membership. There are no recorded CCRs against your property. You never signed any HOA agreements. I'll need to pull some additional records, but unless I'm missing something major, this lien is completely invalid. So what do we do? First, I'll send a formal demand letter to the HOA requiring them to remove the lien within 10 days. I'll cite the legal basis and warn them about potential liability for slander of title. If they don't respond or refuse to remove it, we'll file a lawsuit to quiet title and likely add claims for damages. How long will that take? If they're reasonable and this was an honest mistake, it could be resolved in a couple weeks. If they fight it, we could be looking at several months. But honestly, Mr. Emerson, I don't think they have a leg to stand on. No judge is going to uphold this lien once they see your documentation. I felt some of the tension ease from my shoulders. Okay, let's do it. We spent another 30 minutes going over the details and discussing his fee structure. It wasn't cheap, but it was worth it to protect my property. I signed a retainer agreement, and Martinez promised to have the demand letter sent by the end of the day. That evening, I felt cautiously optimistic. Sarah and I went out for dinner, trying to have a normal evening and not obsess over the HOA situation. But when we got home around 8, there was a white SUV parked in front of our house. As we pulled into the driveway, a woman got out of the vehicle and walked toward us. She was in her mid-50s, with short blonde hair styled in that particular way that somehow always screamed, "Let me speak to the manager." She wore pressed khaki pants and a pink polo shirt, and she carried a clipboard like a weapon. "Are you Derek Emerson?" she called out as I exited my truck. "Who's asking?" "I'm Deborah Winters, president of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA. I received your email and I thought it would be better to discuss this in person." Sarah and I exchanged a glance. "Okay," I said. "Let's talk inside." "Actually, I'd prefer to discuss it out here," Deborah said, gesturing at my house, "since the violations pertain to your exterior property maintenance." "There are no violations because I'm not part of your HOA," I said, keeping my tone firm but polite. "My property isn't in Meadowbrook Estates." Deborah's smile was thin and patronizing. "Mr. Emerson, I understand you believe that, but the fact is, your property is subject to our association's authority. When Meadowbrook Estates was developed, the boundaries were drawn to include all properties within a certain radius of the main development. Your house falls within that radius." "That's not how HOAs work," Sarah said. "You can't just declare someone's property is part of your association." "I'm not declaring anything," Deborah said, her smile never wavering. "I'm simply informing you of what's already established. If you'd like to see the maps and documentation, you're welcome to attend our board meeting next week." "I've already hired a lawyer," I said. "He's reviewed all the property documents. There's no HOA membership attached to my house. The lien you filed is invalid, and we're demanding you remove it." Deborah's expression finally shifted, a flash of annoyance crossing her face. "Mr. Emerson, I'd strongly advise against taking legal action. The HOA has substantial resources and excellent legal counsel. Fighting this will cost you far more than simply paying the fines and coming into compliance." "I'm not paying fines for violations I didn't commit against rules I never agreed to follow," I said. "And I'm not having this conversation on my front lawn at 8:30 at night. You need to leave." "Fine," Deborah said, her voice going cold. "But you should know that every day you remain in violation, additional fines are accruing. You're currently at $8,000. By the end of the month, it'll be over $10,000. These matters only get more expensive the longer you wait." "Get off my property," I said, no longer bothering to hide my anger. Deborah turned and walked back to her SUV, her posture radiating indignation. She drove off without another word, and I stood there in my driveway, fuming. "She actually came to our house," Sarah said, stunned. "Who does that?" "Someone who's used to bullying people into submission," I said. "Come on, let's go inside. I need to call Martinez and let him know about this." I called Martinez's office and left a detailed voicemail about Deborah's visit. He called me back first thing Tuesday morning, and I could hear the anger in his usually calm voice. "That was incredibly inappropriate," he said. "She came to your house to intimidate you. That's going to work in our favor if this goes to court. I sent the demand letter yesterday via email and certified mail. I'm also going to file a motion for a temporary restraining order to prevent them from taking any further action against your property while this is being resolved. Can they really keep adding fines? They can claim whatever they want, but it doesn't make it legal. Don't worry about their threats. Focus on documenting everything. If anyone from the HOA contacts you again, write down the date, time, and what was said. Record conversations if Oregon law allows it, which it does with one-party consent. Okay, I said, feeling a bit better. What's the next step? We wait for their response to the demand letter. They have 10 days. In the meantime, I'm pulling records from when Meadowbrook Estates was developed. I want to see exactly what their boundaries are and whether they've tried this with any other properties. You think they have? I think HOAs don't usually get this aggressive unless they've had success with these tactics before. Someone probably paid up rather than fight, which emboldened them. Over the next week, things escalated in ways I couldn't have predicted. On Wednesday, I came home from work to find a bright orange sticker on my front door declaring my property in violation of HOA standards. I tore it down, took photos, and sent them to Martinez. On Friday, someone left a packet of information in my mailbox about HOA compliance requirements, complete with a highlighted section about legal consequences for non-compliance. Saturday morning, I was mowing the lawn when a man in his 60s approached from the direction of Meadowbrook Estates. He introduced himself as Gerald Foster, a resident of the development. I heard about what's happening with you and the HOA, he said, glancing around as if worried someone might overhear. I wanted to warn you. They did this to the Parkers about 4 years ago. Different house, same situation. The Parkers ended up paying just to make it go away. Where was their house? 2 streets over from you, Oakmont Avenue. The HOA claimed it was part of the development even though it wasn't. The Parkers fought for a few months, but Deborah and the board just kept escalating. They were putting flyers in everyone's mailbox calling the Parkers' house an eyesore, organizing neighborhood complaints. It got so bad the Parkers just paid $5,000 and agreed to follow certain rules to make it stop. That's extortion. Gerald shrugged. Maybe, but it worked. And after that, the HOA has been even more aggressive about enforcement within the actual development. Most of us are too scared to push back on anything. Why are you telling me this? Because some of us are sick of how Deborah runs things. She treats the HOA like her personal fiefdom. If someone actually fights her and wins, it might make things better for the rest of us. He paused. Good luck, Mr. Emerson. Don't let her bully you. He walked away before I could ask more questions. I finished mowing, thinking about the Parkers. Martinez needed to know about this. When I called him Monday morning with the information, he was immediately interested. Can you get me the Parkers' address? If they were coerced into paying for a false claim, that establishes a pattern of behavior. I'll try to find it. I drove over to Oakmont Avenue that evening, looking for a house that might have been the target of similar HOA harassment. It wasn't hard to spot. One house stood out from the others around it. Older, with a different architectural style, clearly built decades before the surrounding properties. I knocked on the door, and a woman in her 40s answered. Hi, I'm sorry to bother you, I said. I'm Derek Emerson. I live over on Clearwater Drive. I'm having an issue with the Meadowbrook Estates HOA, and someone mentioned the Parkers used to live here and had a similar problem. The woman's expression immediately became guarded. The Parkers sold the house to us 3 years ago. I don't know anything about HOA issues. Do you have contact information for them? No, sorry. She started to close the door. Wait, I said. Are you part of the Meadowbrook HOA? She hesitated, then shook her head. Technically no, but we follow their rules anyway. It's just easier that way. You should consider doing the same. She closed the door firmly. I walked back to my truck, frustrated but not surprised. The HOA had successfully intimidated people into compliance, even when they had no legal authority. It made me more determined to fight. Martinez's demand letter got a response on day 9. Deborah Winters, on behalf of the HOA board, refused to remove the lien. Their position was that my property was subject to HOA authority based on the original development plan filed in 2015, and that all fines and penalties were valid. They threatened to foreclose on the lien if payment wasn't received within 60 days. "They're bluffing," Martinez said when he called to tell me. "I've reviewed the development plan they referenced. It clearly shows the boundaries of Meadowbrook Estates, and your property isn't included. I'm filing a lawsuit today for declaratory judgment and to remove the lien. We're also adding a claim for abuse of process and requesting attorney fees. How much is this going to cost me? Depends on how long they drag it out. But if we win, which I'm confident we will, they'll have to pay your legal fees." HOAs are subject to fee-shifting statutes in these kinds of cases. The lawsuit was filed in Multnomah County Circuit Court on March 12, 2026. Martinez sent me a copy of the complaint, and reading it gave me a grim satisfaction. It laid out the facts clearly. I'd never been part of the HOA, my property wasn't subject to their authority, the lien was invalid and had been filed maliciously, or with reckless disregard for the truth, and I was entitled to damages and attorney fees. The HOA had 21 days to respond. During that time, things got worse. Someone spray-painted HOA violator on my fence facing the street. I filed a police report, though the officer who took the report seemed skeptical anything would come of it. More flyers appeared in my mailbox, now including photos of my house with arrows pointing to alleged violations. Someone called the county code enforcement on me, claiming I was running an illegal business from my home. The inspector who showed up was apologetic after I explained the situation, found no violations, and left. Sarah was getting stressed by the constant harassment. "Can't we just move?" she asked one evening after we'd spent an hour scrubbing paint off the fence. "And let them win?" I shook my head. "Besides, we love this house. We're not being driven out because some power-hungry HOA president wants to expand her territory." "I know, but Derek, this is affecting our lives. I don't feel safe with these people targeting us." She was right, and I felt guilty for putting her through this. Martinez says we should have a court date within a few months. Once a judge sees the evidence, this will be over. The HOA filed their response at the end of March. Martinez called me after reviewing it, and he sounded almost amused. "They're claiming that your property was always intended to be part of Meadowbrook Estates based on a preliminary planning document from 2013. They've attached a map that supposedly shows a larger boundary than what was ultimately recorded. Is that going to be a problem?" "No, because preliminary plans don't mean anything. What matters is what was actually filed and recorded with the county. They're grasping at straws." He paused. "But they're also making this personal. Their attorney included some language about you being a scofflaw who refuses to maintain basic property standards. It's inflammatory and unnecessary, which tells me they're angry we're not backing down." "Good. Let them be angry." The case moved through the court system slowly. We had a case management conference in April where the judge set a schedule for discovery and motions. Martinez filed a motion for summary judgment, arguing that the undisputed facts showed I wasn't part of the HOA, and therefore the lien was invalid as a matter of law. The HOA opposed it, claiming there were factual disputes about the boundaries. During discovery, Martinez requested all of the HOA's documents related to their claimed authority over my property. What came back was enlightening. The HOA had no legitimate documents supporting their claim. Instead, they'd manufactured a narrative based on that preliminary 2013 planning document, which had been superseded by the actual development that was built. Martinez also discovered that Deborah Winters had personally driven the campaign against my property, overriding objections from some board members who thought they were exceeding their authority. "This is gold," Martinez said when we met in May to review the discovery materials. "We've got internal emails where board members questioned whether they had jurisdiction over your property, and Deborah insisted they did without providing any legal basis. We've also got evidence that she personally organized the harassment campaign against you. Can we sue her individually?" "We can consider it. Right now, let's focus on getting the lien removed and making sure you're awarded attorney fees. Once that's done, if you want to go after Deborah personally, we can discuss it." The hearing on the motion for summary judgment was scheduled for June 3rd. Martinez prepared extensively, creating a binder of exhibits that included my property documents, the HOA's recorded development plan, the survey showing my property boundaries, and excerpts from the discovery showing the HOA's lack of evidence. The night before the hearing, I barely slept. Sarah and I had invested thousands of dollars in legal fees, spent months dealing with harassment, and endured significant stress. If the judge didn't rule in our favor, I didn't know what we'd do. The hearing was at 9 in the morning. Martinez met me outside the courtroom looking confident. "Judge Morrison is fair and no nonsense. She won't tolerate games. Just let me handle everything." The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with wood paneling and fluorescent lights that hummed quietly. Deborah Winters was there with the HOA's attorney, a stiff man in an expensive suit who looked annoyed to be there. Deborah glared at me as I took my seat behind Martinez. Judge Morrison entered, and we all stood. She was a woman in her 60s with gray hair pulled back in a bun and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. She settled at the bench and reviewed the file briefly before looking up. "This is the motion for summary judgment in Emerson versus Meadowbrook Estates, HOA," she said. "Mr. Martinez, you're moving for summary judgment on behalf of the plaintiff." "Yes, Your Honor." Martinez stood and launched into his argument. He walked the judge through the evidence systematically, explaining that I'd never been part of the HOA, my property wasn't within the recorded boundaries, and there was no legal basis for the lien. He pointed out the HOA's reliance on an unrecorded preliminary document that had been superseded by the actual development. The HOA's attorney, whose name was Douglas Franklin, tried to argue that the preliminary document showed intent to include my property, and that the HOA had been enforcing rules against me in good faith. Judge Morrison interrupted him multiple times, asking pointed questions about why the final recorded development plan didn't match the preliminary one. "Counselor, I'm looking at the recorded plat map," she said, holding up one of the exhibits. "Mr. Emerson's property is clearly outside the boundaries. How can you claim HOA authority over property that isn't part of the development?" "Your Honor, the HOA believed in good faith that belief isn't the standard," Judge Morrison said sharply. "Either the property is subject to HOA authority or it isn't. It's a question of law based on the recorded documents." She looked at Martinez. "Mr. Martinez, what's the case law on this?" Martinez cited 3 Oregon cases where courts had ruled that HOA authority is strictly limited to properties explicitly included in recorded covenants. HOAs can't expand their jurisdiction through enforcement actions or good faith beliefs, he said. The property owner must have actual notice and must have consented to be bound. Judge Morrison nodded slowly. And Mr. Emerson never signed any HOA documents. Correct, Your Honor. He specifically purchased property outside the HOA to avoid those restrictions. Mr. Franklin, do you have any evidence that Mr. Emerson consented to HOA membership? No, Your Honor, but then I'm granting the motion for summary judgment. Judge Morrison made a note in the file. The lien is invalid and must be removed immediately. Mr. Franklin, your client will execute a lien release within 5 business days and file it with the county. Mr. Martinez, prepare an order to that effect. Thank you, Your Honor, Martinez said. We're also requesting attorney fees and costs. File a motion with supporting documentation. I'll review it. Anything else? No, Your Honor. Mr. Franklin, the HOA's attorney looked like he'd been slapped. Your Honor, we'd like to request a stay pending appeal. On what grounds? This is a straightforward property law case, and you've presented no evidence supporting your client's position. Motion denied. We're adjourned. Judge Morrison stood and left the courtroom. I sat there for a moment, processing what had just happened. Martinez turned to me with a genuine smile. That's as decisive as it gets. Congratulations. We stepped into the hallway and I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. So it's over, for the most part. They'll have to remove the lien within 5 days. I'll file the motion for attorney fees, and assuming the judge grants it, they'll have to pay your legal costs. They could appeal, but frankly, I don't think they will. They don't have any grounds, and it would just cost them more money. Deborah Winters emerged from the courtroom with Franklin. She looked furious, her face red and her jaw clenched. She started toward us, but Franklin put a hand on her arm and steered her away. They disappeared down the hallway without a word. Over the next week, I waited anxiously for the lien release. Martinez followed up with Franklin's office daily. On day 4, Franklin sent over the executed release, and Martinez filed it with the county. By June 10th, the lien was officially removed from my property record. Martinez filed the motion for attorney fees with detailed billing records showing I'd spent just over $12,000 fighting the HOA. Judge Morrison scheduled a hearing for late June, but before it could happen, Franklin called Martinez with a settlement offer. They'll pay your full attorney fees plus $5,000 in additional damages if you agree not to pursue any further claims against the HOA or its board members, Martinez relayed to me over the phone. So Deborah doesn't face any consequences for what she did. That's essentially what they're asking. It's your call. We can turn down the offer and pursue the abusive process claim, but that will take more time, and there's no guarantee we'll get more than what they're offering. Or you can take the settlement and be done with it. I thought about it for a long time. Part of me wanted to drag Deborah through the legal system to make her pay for the months of harassment and stress. But another part of me just wanted it to be over. Sarah and I had been living under a cloud for half a year, and I was ready to move on. I'll take the settlement, I said finally. But I wanted in writing that the HOA acknowledges my property is not and has never been part of their association, and that they'll never attempt to enforce any rules or assess any fines against me again. I'll make sure that's included, Martinez said. The settlement agreement was executed on July 2nd, 2026. The HOA paid $17,000 into Martinez's trust account, which covered my legal fees and the additional damages. They signed a document explicitly acknowledging my property was outside their jurisdiction. In exchange, I released all claims against them. A few weeks after the settlement, I ran into Gerald Foster again at a local hardware store. He seemed pleased to see me. "I heard you won against the HOA," he said. "Is that true?" "Yeah, it's all settled now." "That's incredible. You know what happened after?" I shook my head. "There was a special meeting. A bunch of residents got together and voted to remove Deborah as HOA president. Turns out a lot of people were fed up with how she was running things, but nobody had the guts to challenge her until you fought back and won. She's off the board entirely now." I felt a surge of satisfaction. Good. She shouldn't be in a position of power over anyone. The new board president is a reasonable guy named Tom Chen. He's already implementing changes, making things less authoritarian. So, thank you. You standing up to Deborah made a difference for all of us. We shook hands and parted ways. I drove home feeling genuinely happy for the first time in months. Sarah was in the garden when I pulled up, wearing her old jeans and a sun hat. She looked up and smiled as I approached. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Everything's perfect," I said. I told her about running into Gerald and what he'd said about Deborah being removed from the HOA board. Sarah's smile widened. "So it wasn't just about us. You helped a whole neighborhood." "I guess I did." That evening, we sat on the back deck with cold beers, watching the sun set over the trees along the creek. The property was quiet and peaceful, exactly why we'd bought it in the first place. No HOA, no restrictions, no busybodies telling us what we could or couldn't do with our own home. "You know what's funny?" Sarah said after a while. "When we first got that letter, I was terrified. I thought we might lose the house." "I was scared too," I admitted. "But we did the right thing. We fought back instead of giving in." "Do you think Deborah really believed she had authority over our property, or was it a scam?" I'd thought about that question a lot. I think it started as overreach and became something worse. She wanted to expand the HOA's power and revenue. When the Parkers paid up, it encouraged her to try again. She got used to people backing down, so when we didn't, she doubled down instead of admitting she was wrong. Well, she picked the wrong person to bully. Damn right she did. We sat in comfortable silence for a while. The ordeal had been expensive, stressful, and time-consuming, but it had also taught me something important about standing up for yourself. A lot of people in the Parker situation would have just paid the money to make the problem go away. It seemed easier, cheaper, faster. But giving in to bullies only encourages them to bully others. A few days later, I got a handwritten note in the mail. It was from Tom Chen, the new Meadowbrook Estates HOA president. He apologized for what Deborah and the previous board had put me through, acknowledged that they'd acted outside their authority, and assured me I'd never be bothered by the HOA again. He also mentioned they were reviewing their enforcement policies to prevent similar abuses in the future. I appreciated the gesture. It wasn't Tom's fault, and it took integrity to reach out and apologize on behalf of the organization. I wrote back thanking him and wishing him luck with the new board. As summer progressed, life returned to normal. I went to work, came home, and enjoyed my property without worrying about HOA violations or liens. Sarah and I started planning some improvements. A new deck, a small workshop for me, maybe a greenhouse for her. All things we could do without needing approval from anyone. One Saturday in August, I was out front trimming the hedges when a car pulled up. A middle-aged couple got out and approached me hesitantly. "Are you Derek Emerson?" the man asked. "Yeah, that's me." "I'm Paul Richmond, and this is my wife Linda. We live about a mile from here. We're having a similar problem with a different HOA claiming our property is part of their development, even though we never signed anything. Someone told us you fought your HOA and won. We were hoping you could give us some advice." I set down my hedge trimmers and gestured toward the porch. "Come on up. Let me tell you what happened and who my lawyer was. We spent an hour talking. Paul and Linda's situation was remarkably similar to mine. They owned a house that had been there long before the surrounding development was built, and the HOA had started demanding they pay dues and comply with rules. They'd received their first fine notice 2 weeks ago and didn't know what to do. "The important thing is don't pay anything and don't acknowledge their authority," I told them. "Get a lawyer immediately. The longer you wait, the more they'll escalate." I gave them Robert Martinez's contact information and walked them through what to expect in terms of costs and timeline. "Thank you so much," Linda said as they were leaving. "We were thinking about just paying it to avoid trouble, but after hearing your story, we're going to fight." "Good," I said. "Don't let them bully you." After they left, I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't expected. What happened to me had been awful, but at least I could use the experience to help others in similar situations. Maybe that was the silver lining. The rest of August and into September were blissfully uneventful. Martinez sent me a final accounting of the settlement, confirming that all fees had been paid and the case was closed. I framed the order from Judge Morrison, declaring that my property wasn't part of the HOA and hung it in my office, half as a reminder and half as a trophy. In October, I got a call from Paul Richmond. He sounded excited. "We hired Martinez like you suggested. He sent a demand letter and the HOA backed down immediately. They withdrew all fines and acknowledged we're not part of their association. We didn't even have to sue." "That's fantastic," I said, genuinely happy for them. "I'm glad it worked out. It's because you already established the precedent. Martinez told us that once an HOA loses a case like yours, they're much less likely to try the same thing again. You saved us months of fighting." After we hung up, I thought about that. My case had created a record, a warning to overreaching HOAs that they couldn't just claim authority over properties they didn't actually govern. It felt good to know that the months of stress and the thousands of dollars in legal fees had accomplished something beyond just protecting my own house. Thanksgiving came, and Sarah and I hosted dinner for the first time in our house. Her parents came, along with my brother and his family. It was a full house, chaotic and warm and exactly what we'd envisioned when we bought the place. My brother, who lived in a neighborhood with an HOA he despised, toasted me during dinner. To Derek, who proved you can fight City Hall, or at least fight the HOA, which is pretty much the same thing. Everyone laughed and raised their glasses. Later, my brother pulled me aside. "Seriously, man, what you did was impressive. Most people don't have the guts to stand up like that." "I didn't really have a choice," I said. "They were threatening my home. You always have a choice. You could have paid them off like those other people did. But you fought, and you won, and now they can't do it to anyone else. That matters." As the year wound down toward the holidays, I reflected on everything that had happened. It had been one of the most stressful periods of my life, but also one where I'd learned a lot about the legal system, about standing up for yourself, and about the importance of not letting bullies win. Deborah Winters had thought she could intimidate me into compliance. She'd weaponized the HOA's perceived authority to harass and threaten me, hoping I'd cave under pressure. Instead, she'd lost her position, cost her HOA $17,000, and created legal precedent that protected other homeowners from similar abuse. By December, the whole ordeal felt like something that had happened to a different person. Sarah and I were happy. The house was ours free and clear with no clouds on the title, and life was good. We put up Christmas lights without worrying about HOA restrictions on decoration height or color schemes. I parked my work truck in the driveway without fear of fines. Our fence remained the color we'd chosen, and our lawn was maintained to our standards, not someone else's. On Christmas Eve, we were sitting by the fireplace when Sarah said, "You know what the best present is this year?" "What's that?" "Peace. Just being able to enjoy our home without all that stress hanging over us." "I'll drink to that," I said, and we clinked our wine glasses together. The whole experience had cost me about $5,000 out of pocket even after the settlement, countless hours of stress and lost sleep, and had put a strain on my marriage that we'd had to work through. But it had also been worth it. I'd protected my property rights, helped others do the same, and contributed to removing a tyrant from a position of power where she could hurt people. If I had to do it all over again, knowing what I know now, I wouldn't change a thing. Well, maybe I'd hire Martinez sooner and save myself some of the stress of trying to handle it alone at first. But the decision to fight, that was right, and I'd make it again in a heartbeat. New Year's Eve arrived, and Sarah and I stayed home, watching the celebration on TV and toasting with champagne at midnight. As the fireworks exploded on the screen and the crowd cheered, I thought about the year ahead. No lawsuits, no HOA drama, just normal life. "What's your resolution?" Sarah asked. "To enjoy what we have and not take it for granted," I said. "This house, our freedom, each other. What's yours?" "Same," she said, leaning against me. "And maybe to finally build that greenhouse." "Deal. We'll start in the spring." The months that followed were everything I'd hoped for when we first bought the house. I worked on various projects around the property, adding a workshop in the back corner where I could build furniture and tinker with things. Sarah got her greenhouse, and by April it was full of seedlings and plants. We had friends over for barbecues, and nobody mentioned HOAs or property liens or legal battles. In May, about a year after our court victory, I ran into Robert Martinez at a local coffee shop. He was with his wife, and they were clearly on a weekend morning date, but he stopped to chat. "How's everything going?" he asked. "Perfect. No problems at all. The HOA has left us completely alone." "Good, that's how it should be." He paused. "You know, your case has become something I cite fairly regularly now. I've had 3 more clients with similar HOA overreach issues, and in each case, I've been able to reference Judge Morrison's ruling in your case. It's made the HOAs back down quickly. Paul Richmond told me you helped him." "I did. That case resolved in 2 weeks because we could point to your precedent. So, thank you for having the courage to fight it through. You made my job easier and helped a lot of people you'll never meet." We parted ways, and I walked back to my truck feeling proud. Not in an arrogant way, but in the quiet satisfaction of knowing I'd done something that mattered. The system had worked. Justice had prevailed. The bullies had lost. That afternoon, I was working in my workshop when Sarah came out with her phone. "You need to see this," she said, showing me a local news article. The headline read, "Former HOA President Charged with Embezzlement." I took the phone and read. Deborah Winters had been arrested and charged with embezzling over $50,000 from the Meadowbrook Estates HOA funds during her tenure as president. The new board had conducted an audit after taking over and discovered she'd been writing checks to herself for fake expenses and contractors who didn't exist. The district attorney had filed charges, and she was facing multiple felony counts. "Wow," I said, reading through the article. "I guess she was even worse than we thought. Do you think they'll convict her with that kind of evidence?" "Probably." I handed back the phone. "I almost feel bad for her. Almost." "I don't," Sarah said firmly. "She tried to steal our house to cover up her theft, or to generate more revenue she could embezzle. People like that deserve whatever they get." She wasn't wrong. Looking back, the aggressive stance the HOA took against my property made more sense now. Deborah had probably been desperate for revenue to hide her embezzlement, or at least to show the books were healthy. Expanding the HOA's reach to include properties like mine would have meant more dues, more fine revenue, more money she could potentially siphon off. A few weeks later, there was a follow-up article. Deborah had pled guilty to avoid trial, and the judge sentenced her to 3 years in prison and ordered her to pay full restitution to the HOA. Her mugshot accompanied the article, and she looked nothing like the imperious woman who'd confronted me in my driveway. She looked defeated, older, scared. I didn't take pleasure in her downfall, but I didn't feel sympathy either. She'd hurt people, abused her authority, stolen money, and tried to intimidate homeowners into compliance to serve her own interests. The consequences were appropriate. Tom Chen, the new HOA president, sent me another note after Deborah's sentencing. He thanked me again for standing up to her, explained that they'd recovered most of the embezzled funds through insurance and Deborah's restitution payments, and assured me that the HOA was now operating transparently and fairly. He invited me to attend a community barbecue they were hosting, an open event for everyone in the area, not just HOA members. Sarah and I went to the barbecue in July. It was held at the community park in Meadowbrook Estates, with grills and tables set up under shade trees. Tom Chen greeted us warmly, introducing us to other board members and residents. Several people came up to thank me for fighting the HOA, saying it had led to positive changes in how the association operated. "You're a hero around here," one woman said, only half joking. "I'm just a guy who didn't want to pay fines he didn't owe," I said, uncomfortable with the attention. "Don't sell yourself short," Tom said. "What you did took real courage, and it exposed Deborah's corruption. If you hadn't fought back, she might have gotten away with embezzling even more money." We stayed for a couple hours, eating burgers and talking with neighbors. It was strange to be welcomed by the very organization that had tried to put a lien on my house, but the new leadership had clearly changed the culture. People seemed relaxed and happy, not living in fear of fines and violations. As we drove home, Sarah said, "That was actually really nice. Maybe HOAs aren't all bad. When they're run by reasonable people with appropriate authority, they're fine," I said. "The problem is when they're run by tyrants who think they own everyone's property and can do whatever they want." Well, at least that's not happening anymore in Meadowbrook. The rest of the summer passed quietly. I finished several projects around the house. Sarah's garden flourished, and we settled into a comfortable rhythm. The HOA debacle had become a story we told at parties, an anecdote about the time we had to sue our way out of something we were never part of in the first place. In September, I got a call from a reporter at a local newspaper who was doing a story about HOA disputes. Someone had given him my name, and he wanted to interview me about my experience. I agreed, figuring it might help other people in similar situations understand their rights. The interview took about an hour. The reporter, a young guy named Kevin, asked detailed questions about the timeline, the legal process, and what advice I'd give to others facing HOA overreach. The article ran 2 weeks later with the headline "Homeowner Wins Legal Battle Against HOA Overreach." It was fair and accurate, presenting my case as an example of why property owners need to know their rights and be willing to fight for them. After the article came out, I got a few phone calls and emails from people with their own HOA horror stories. Some asked for advice, which I tried to provide. Others just wanted to vent, and I listened. The common thread was frustration with HOA boards that exceeded their authority and homeowners who felt powerless to push back. "You should start a website or something," Sarah suggested. "Help people navigate these situations." "I'm not a lawyer," I said. "I can't give legal advice, but you can share your experience and point people toward resources. Think about it." I did think about it, but ultimately decided against it. I'd lived through the HOA battle and come out the other side. I'd helped a few people along the way. That was enough. I didn't want to become the anti-HOA crusader, spending my time immersed in other people's property disputes. I wanted to move on and enjoy my life. By the time fall arrived, the whole ordeal felt like ancient history. The leaves changed color, the air turned crisp, and Sarah and I took long walks on the weekends through the neighborhood, admiring the autumn scenery. My property looked great, maintained to our standards without anyone else's input. The fence was solid, the lawn was healthy, and the house was exactly what we wanted it to be. One Saturday in October, I was raking leaves when a car pulled into the driveway. It was Tom Chen. He got out with a bottle of wine and a smile. "Sorry to drop by unannounced," he said. "I wanted to give you this as a thank you from the HOA board. We had a vote, and everyone agreed you deserved recognition for exposing the problems with the previous leadership." I accepted the wine, surprised and a bit touched. "That's very kind. Thank you." "No, thank you. The association is in much better shape now, financially and culturally. We're not perfect, but we're trying to do things right, and that wouldn't have happened if you hadn't stood up to Deborah." We talked for a few minutes, and then Tom left. I brought the wine inside and showed it to Sarah. "The HOA gave us a gift," I said, still slightly amazed. She laughed. "That's something I never thought I'd hear. Should we open it?" "Why not?" We opened the wine that evening and toasted to new beginnings, second chances, and the importance of standing up for what's right. It was good wine, and it felt like a fitting end to a chapter of our lives that had been difficult but ultimately worthwhile. As the year drew to a close again, I found myself thinking about everything I'd learned from the experience. I'd learned that legal documents matter, that knowing your rights is crucial, and that bullies often back down when confronted with someone who won't give in. I'd learned that the legal system, while slow and expensive, can work when you have the facts on your side. And I'd learned that sometimes fighting for yourself means fighting for others too, even if you don't realize it at the time. Christmas came and went, and then another New Year's Eve. Sarah and I toasted to 2027, grateful for the peace and stability we'd found. The house was ours, truly and completely, with no liens, no claims, and no threats from anyone. In early January, I got a text from Paul Richmond. "Just wanted to let you know that our neighborhood is forming a coalition of non-HOA properties to protect against future overreach. Your case was the inspiration. Thanks again for everything." I texted back congratulations and encouragement. It felt good to know that my fight had ripple effects, that other people were taking steps to protect themselves based on what I'd gone through. Looking back on the whole experience now, from the initial shock of receiving that Lien notice to the final resolution and beyond, I realized it had changed me in subtle ways. I was more confident, more willing to stand up for myself, and more aware of my rights as a property owner. I'd faced down a bully and won, and that knowledge gave me a sense of strength I carried forward into other areas of my life. Sarah noticed it too. "You're different now," she said one evening, "more self-assured. I guess fighting a lawsuit and winning will do that to you." "It's a good look on you," she said, kissing my cheek. The months continued to pass uneventfully, which was exactly what we wanted. Spring came again, bringing new growth to Sarah's greenhouse and new projects to my workshop. We celebrated our 5th wedding anniversary with a trip to the coast, staying in a small bed and breakfast and walking on the beach. Life was good, simple, and free from the stress of legal battles. One afternoon in late April, I was working on building a bookshelf when my phone rang. It was Robert Martinez. We'd stayed in touch casually, exchanging emails occasionally, but he rarely called. "Derek, I wanted to give you a heads up," he said. "Judge Morrison cited your case in a ruling today on another HOA dispute. It's becoming established precedent in Oregon for these kinds of situations. You should be proud." "That's great," I said, meaning it. "Glad it's helping people. More than you know." HOAs across the state are being more careful about enforcement now because they know courts won't tolerate overreach. Your case changed things. After we hung up, I sat in my workshop thinking about that. I'd never set out to change anything. I just wanted to protect my house, my property, my rights. But in doing so, I'd contributed to something larger. It was a humbling feeling and a satisfying one. That evening, I told Sarah about Martinez's call. She smiled and hugged me. "See, you made a difference." "We made a difference," I corrected. "You supported me through all of it. I couldn't have done it without you." "True," she said with a grin. "So what do we do to celebrate? How about we just enjoy the fact that we can sit on our deck, in our yard, at our house, without worrying about anyone telling us we're doing it wrong? Perfect." And that's exactly what we did. We sat outside as the sun set, listening to the sounds of the creek and the birds, feeling grateful for what we had and how we'd fought to keep it. The HOA battle was over, truly and completely over. Deborah Winters was in prison, her schemes exposed. The Lien was gone, erased from the public record as if it had never existed. My property was mine, protected by law and by precedent. Sometimes I drive past Meadowbrook Estates and see the houses with their neat lawns and uniform appearance. I don't harbor any resentment toward the place or the people who live there. They chose to be part of an HOA, to trade certain freedoms for certain benefits, and that was their right. My only objection had been when they tried to force that choice on me, to claim authority they didn't have over property they didn't govern. The story could have ended differently. I could have paid the $8,000 and agreed to follow their rules, avoiding the stress and expense of a lawsuit. The Parkers had taken that route, and I didn't blame them. Sometimes the fight isn't worth it, but for me it was. It was about principle, about property rights, about not letting bullies win, and we won. Not just in court, but in every way that mattered. We kept our house, our freedom, and our peace of mind. We helped other people do the same. We contributed to legal precedent that protected property owners across Oregon. And we proved that sometimes standing up to power is worth the cost. As I sit here now, 2 years after that first threatening letter arrived, I can say with certainty that fighting back was the right decision. It wasn't easy, it wasn't cheap, and it wasn't always pleasant. But it was right. And in the end, that's what matters most. My house at 4782 Clearwater Drive sits on its half-acre exactly as it always has, free from HOA control, governed only by the rules Sarah and I set for ourselves. The trees grow as they will, the fence stands in its original color, and my work truck parks in the driveway every single night. It's not perfect, it's not uniform, and it's not subject to anyone's standards but our own. And that's exactly how it should be.